And the Department of Public Enterprises saying it's working with Eskom and Treasury to find money for diesel. This is for the utility Eskom. Now, they're saying that it follows an urgent meeting last night between the Minister, Pravin Gordhan, and the Eskom board, the power utility, already having spent 11 billion rand on diesel in just over 6 months. Well, let's get a reaction now on this development, and we speak to Mr. Vally Padayachee, former Eskom executive manager and former City Power executive in the city of Johannesburg. Mr. Padayachee, thank you very much for your time and your continued contribution. You talk to us often, and I sometimes wonder whether we are going to fast run out of questions to ask around Eskom. But perhaps the most important one is the statement coming out last night. The heading of that statement from the Department of Public Enterprises says the following: government and Eskom will find money for diesel. Why was it left till the last minute for them to realize that this was an issue?
Good morning, Corey, and a very good morning to your viewers as well. And I'm glad to be back, albeit the particular circumstances. I think that statement last night is definitely most welcome and definitely a step in the right direction. And let me tell you why. Because, as I've always said in the past programs, that the lights were really kept on. In other words, the lights of South Africa were really kept on in the last year and a half, even longer, through the usage of what we call diesel-fired open-cycle gas turbines. In other words, Coley, if we had not used those diesel-fired gas turbines so extensively, our load shedding level would be at least 2 levels more. In other words, if we were load shedding at level 2 with the diesel-fired gas turbines in operation, we could have been load shedding at 4 and above if we didn't have those open cycle gas turbines in operation. But just to get back to your question, why it's left too late? Well, I can't answer that for government. I don't talk for government. But I think the important thing is that I think if government did not react quickly vis-a-vis in coming up with extra funding, although I believe there's no free lunch, then the situation from the economic point of view would have gone through the roof.
Mr. Padayachee, this is quite an important conversation. I'm going to ask if you could just hold your thoughts for just a few more minutes, because we want to take you just after the 10 o'clock headlines. But as we edge closer to that, let's quickly answer this question before those headlines at 10. As you correctly put it, the open cycle gas turbines is what has been keeping Eskom at least at lower levels of load shedding, but it's a very expensive exercise. Why is it then that there doesn't seem to have been planning around this money?
Okay, I think there has been some planning. I mean, as I understand it, in terms of Eskom's budget, I think the budget is about 12 billion rand a year, said to be corrected. And as has been reported even in the media briefing last week, they've already used 11 billion since March. So, and hence they put a stop, as of last week, on using diesel. So there has been some planning, but the planning regimes have gone through the roof because of particular circumstances on the ground.
Okay. All right. Let's pause there for a moment. We're going to continue just after 10 o'clock. Vally Padayachee will continue this conversation in a moment. watching Newsfeed AM. Welcome to the second hour of Newsfeed AM. Well, if you've been with us since the last hour, we have been in conversation with Vally Padayachee, former Eskom executive manager and former City Power executive in Johannesburg. Mr. Padayachee, thanks for staying on. I've got to ask you a very direct question here, because I just think that it is unavoidable, or at least it has become unavoidable, judging by comments from people, at least across the social media platforms. Why does the minister, Pravin Gordhan, still have his job, in your view? And add to that question another question where people say the Eskom CEO perhaps may have overstayed his welcome, given the kind of load shedding we have been subjected to.
Okay, let me try and be as direct as possible, but also being professional about it. I think why the Minister Pravin Gordhan still keeps his job, I think that's for the prerogative of the President to answer, because ministers are appointed at the behest of the President. I'm not trying to duck the question, but I'm just trying to stick to the facts. And the President needs to assess whether the Minister has been doing his job, and of course, in that respect, we all have our views there. In terms of, on a similar vein, whether the Eskom CEO has overstepped his stay in the position, let me answer it in the following way, also being professional about it. I think, and I've argued this in previous programs, that what Eskom needs now is a leadership team that's geared for a business unusual situation. It needs a leadership team that can address a firefighting mode and address a turnaround situation. It's no longer a case of where it's business as usual. And generally, in a business unusual situation, you need a CEO that knows his beans. In other words, he knows the business, is competent from that point of view, and is able to think on his feet. I would argue that you need a CEO that's technically qualified, that has calluses on his fingers, calluses in the brain, and I say that with respect, and we can, and I leave that to you to decide whether Mr. Durator has those credentials. I don't have anything against him personally, but I think for a business unusual situation, you need to weigh his credentials against what's required for the business now. I have my views on that. It may not be in sync with what some of the key stakeholders have, but I believe that you need a leadership team and a CEO that's geared for a business unusual situation, a turnaround situation, a CEO that's here for the crisis management situation, not a business unusual situation.
Sure.
Sorry, not a business as usual situation.
And so, to simplify your response around Andre de Ruyter's suitability, are you of the same view that Eskom needs an engineer? Is that what you're saying?
Well, I would say, having come from Eskom, you need a person who's technically qualified in addition to the other attributes, because when you get reports and feedback from your team, I would argue, if he gets feedback from the COO, who's an engineer, he needs to be in a position to weigh that feedback and balance the risk and so on, and make a call. Sometimes he needs to make a call which may go against the grain of the team. But you can only do that, I would argue, in a safe and prudent manner if you are, for want of a better word, more competent than your team, especially in a crisis situation. In a business as usual situation, you can rely on your team totally. But if you look at some of the previous CEOs, the previous competent CEOs of Eskom, who were able to take decisions on that basis, they were all engineers. So I'll leave it to you to make that call.
I think it's clear what you're saying, because that job then becomes even more difficult when you're going to have the generation heads resigning one after the other. That doesn't spell good news. There is another argument, or at least a conversation that's been had in other circles. Let me call it political circles. I'm not asking you a political question. I'm simply asking whether or not you think Eskom, residing under the portfolio of public enterprises, is perhaps well placed there under the management of that minister, when there is talk that there is the energy minister, who, by the way, may have expressed an interest that Eskom be brought under his stewardship. Would that make any difference?
Yes, I'm glad you asked that question, but you asked it in a very different way. But let me respond to you directly. I've also made the argument in a different forum that we must be careful. South Africa does not have a load shedding problem per se. South Africa has a national energy security supply problem, which from a policy perspective resides in the departments of mineral and energy. So we have a national energy security supply crisis, I would say, which is characterized by the electricity crisis evidenced by the load shedding. So the Ministry of DMRE has a national accountability, like many other countries, to dictate policy in that respect and to secure the energy security. So Eskom, which is a major state-owned utility, plays a significant role in the execution of that policy. So if the minister, DMRE, does not have total control over Eskom because it sits in another ministry, and if it's a risk, and so in that situation, to national policy, then government must have a rethink about that. So it's not a case of whether it sits with public enterprises, whether it makes good sense. I'm saying from a national energy security policy perspective, it makes sense that the DMRE ministry has control over that value chain. And I would argue that the Eskom electricity crisis, in fact it's a country's electricity crisis evidenced by the Eskom load shedding, which poses a huge risk to the national energy supply security crisis situation. So, in a nutshell, from a policy perspective, from a strategic perspective, it makes sense for that aspect of the value chain, meaning the Eskom business, to sit within DMRE. And I'm also making the aspect, as long as the policies of DMRE are also apt and are prudent and falls in line.
Final question to you. The President has just touched down in the United Kingdom, coming out of COP27, where he again ramped up the talk around the just energy transition. I'd like to ask you around renewables versus coal, which we are told is going to be phased out gradually. That's what the Eskom CEO actually placed emphasis on at COP27, that the transition from coal to clean energy is going to be something that is done gradually. But here's a question for you. Has coal ever been proven anywhere in the world to have been used as a clean energy source? There's a reason I'm asking you this question.
Yes, and I'm glad you asked that question because it's a very sensitive subject. The just energy transition, I think we must all support that. I personally support that. I think the move from a high carbon to a low carbon scenario must be encouraged. But we must be very careful, and in the interest of time, I want to get quickly to the point. We must be very careful that we don't throw the baby away with the bath water, right? Because given that we are in a crisis situation, we've got to use all available technologies, all affordable available technologies that can add value to sorting out this crisis situation. And I would argue this crisis is not going to last for 2 or 3 years. I think it's going to last a lot longer given the global macroeconomics situation, the Russian-Ukraine war. I would also put in now the US-Chinese, Taiwanese tension. All of that is going to delay the supply chain issues. So in terms of coal, South Africa has an abundant supply of coal. Now, I'm not making a case for coal per se. I'm making a case for clean coal technologies.
Yeah.
And there are clean coal technologies available, right? And I'm saying that in this crisis situation, that there could be an opportunity for Eskom, with Eskom has done work around clean coal technologies, to revisit those technologies, and maybe within 2 years, 3 years, we could implement clean coal technologies into the energy mix of South Africa so that we mitigate that risk of not meeting demand.
So let me quickly come in there, because we have to end the conversation. But as I said to you earlier, I have a reason for why I asked you this question. So you have just confirmed what has been said recently by Dr. Humphrey Mathe, who is the chairman of the Council for Geosciences. And this is what he had to say, and I quote, "We have a lot of coal in South Africa, and we can clean the coal so that we supply it to power plants." And I want to juxtapose that with the view of Andre de Ruyter, who sat in this very studio one time, interviewed by me, who said, this has been tried before. It hasn't worked, and we are not going to be pumping money into such. Whose view is correct and whose view is not correct?
Let me answer it this way. I think there are cases globally where such technologies have worked, right? Maybe not at the level of other technologies, but I'm saying in a crisis situation, and I'm repeating, in a crisis situation, all options must be on the table, and given that South Africa has an abundant supply of coal, then we've got to revisit that technology and do the business case, etc., and then take a final call as to whether it's applicable. But I'm of the opinion that in a crisis management situation, the decision-making process would be of such a nature that we may have to incorporate, albeit for a short time maybe, a clean coal technology into the energy mix. And I think I'm confident that we'll be able to do that.
Vally Padayachee, let me thank you very much for your time, former Eskom Executive Manager and former City Power Executive.